During the Soviet era, many families lost their children overnight. Tens of thousands of babies ended up in orphanages after repressions against their parents or other tragic circumstances from which neither children nor adults could protect themselves. Shelters were supposed to take care of the children, give them a roof over their heads, food, and protection. But somehow, even here, unexplained disappearances were occurring. Children were disappearing, and there were no answers to questions about where they were. Where were they disappearing to? And why was the state covering it up? One of the most frightening aspects is the fact that in the 30s and 40s, state archives on children from orphanages were often classified, and many data were simply destroyed. These archives held information about the parents, as well as the health and education of the children. But the most mysterious thing is that these archives also contained information about children who suddenly disappeared. Why were they destroyed? It happened that parents who survived the repressions or returned from the front tried to get their children back. But even when they found traces of the child in the orphanage, officials refused to explain anything and refused to return the children. Parents were threatened and could do nothing about it. These people were left helpless in the face of a Soviet system that stood firm. Some children disappeared without a trace, and their fates remained unknown. And those who wanted to know the truth faced an even greater wall of silence. It is known that some documents about the children still remain in closed archives, and even today, almost a century later, no one can fully understand what really happened to these children. But why did the state destroy archives and intimidate parents? And why, even decades later, are there still questions to which no one has provided answers? In the USSR, orphanages seemed like a kind of shelter for children without parents. But behind the doors of these institutions lurked a very different reality. Children who were not abandoned but lost by their parents, children of those who were called enemies of the people, were often taken here. Parents were arrested, sent to camps, or even shot, and their children ended up in orphanages. They were not allowed to remember their parents because if they were considered enemies, their children were also considered dangerous. In the orphanages, children were told to forget their family as if their past should not exist. One of the most frightening aspects of Soviet orphanages was overcrowding. There were so many children that there were sometimes 30 or even 40 children per caretaker. How can there be care and concern if one adult simply cannot keep up with so many children? In such conditions, children were often left to fend for themselves or each other, making orphanages a chaotic and sometimes dangerous place. In such overcrowded facilities, the disappearance of children could be overlooked. It was believed that children were moved from one shelter to another, and caretakers simply did not have time to keep track of the movements. It was almost impossible for parents to find a child, as documents were not always sent with them, and the new shelters often did not receive names, dates of birth, or even data on the health status of the children. In such an environment, finding a particular child became an almost impossible task. Some children, once in the system, remained there for life. They were considered orphans, even if they had living parents somewhere else in the city. Rejections were met at every turn, and many orphanages would not allow children to see anyone from the outside at all. Children who might still have had parents learned that they were supposedly dead, and the state became their only family. So why was all this happening? Why was it profitable for the state to keep children in such conditions and tear them away from their real families? Perhaps in this way it was trying to raise a new generation that would not know about its roots and would not think about the past. Children in Soviet orphanages were brought up in such a way that they had no personal memories and no family, and therefore no old ideas. What if among these forgotten children were those who disappeared for a reason? Mysterious disappearances and unofficial data. Among the hundreds of children who ended up in orphanages in the USSR, there were those whose traces were lost literally in the middle of nowhere. Parents or relatives tried to find them years later when they had at least some chance of finding out what had happened to them. But suddenly it turned out that there was simply no data about the child. These children seemed to have disappeared without a trace, and there was no word in the documents about where they might have been sent or what happened to them. Official data on children who ended up in orphanages were kept in special archives. But here is just one strange fact. From time to time, records about children disappeared during inspections. The archives for so-called special children, orphans of the repressed, were not kept, and instead there were blank sheets or, on the contrary, closed folders that no one was allowed to look through. This meant that even years and decades later, the relatives of these children could not learn the truth. There were no archives, which meant that the child simply disappeared in the eyes of the state. It is known that some children whose traces disappeared may have gotten jobs in closed institutions. The Soviet Union at the time was creating secret facilities and scientific centers that operated without any extra eyes or documents. As horrible as it sounds, the facts show that children could have been used in the work at such facilities. The orphanages said that the children were taken away for important work or to a new home, but in reality their fates remained a mystery. Even more frightening is the information that some children may have been the subjects of medical experiments. So why were these disappearances made possible? One reason is the complete subordination of the orphanages to the state, where even the caretakers did not know where their wards were going. It was also due to the secrecy of the archives, where information disappeared or was stored in such a way that outsiders could not access it. The Soviet authorities sought to control not only the lives, but also the memory of those who lived in the USSR. The role of the state in the fate of orphans. Imagine a world where every step of your life depends on instructions from above, and your own past is a secret you are forbidden to know. This was the case with thousands of orphans in the USSR. The state didn't just take care of them, it had complete control over their lives, their fate, and even their memories. Children were distributed to orphanages and closed institutions, and often no one knew who they were or where they came from. Even the names and histories of the families were carefully concealed. Sometimes a child had living relatives who were looking for him or her, but officials allowed no contact. Children belonged to the state, not to their families. Many orphans recall being taken to closed institutions for so-called psychological rehabilitation. No one knew exactly what happened there, but when they returned, the children behaved strangely and sometimes simply disappeared. Their fates became a mystery, as did the process of this rehabilitation itself. As a rule, these institutions were far away from big cities, and the children who went there often never saw their friends or caretakers from the orphanages again. They were probably meant to become ideal citizens who do not remember or know anything about their past, and perhaps that is why they were separated from those around them. Another mystery is the cases when children were handed over to the families of party officials and high-ranking employees. It would seem that the child was found a new family, but even here things were not so simple. The origin of these children was concealed, their names and dates of birth were changed, and these children grew up not realizing that they had once been called by other names. Orphanage residents who were given this opportunity were in fact denied the right to know who they were. In some cases, it was not until many years later that they accidentally learned of their past and present origins. It was as if the state was afraid that these children might grow up and want to find out what happened to their real parents. So it was better to erase the past and raise them with a different biography with nothing extra in it. For example, children of repressed parents were taught that their mother and father were enemies of the people and could not be trusted with memories or feelings about the family. Secrets that are still unsolved. The fates of many children who disappeared in Soviet orphanages remain a mystery even today. In the USSR, orphanages were closed institutions, and little information about those who grew up in them has survived. Even decades later, many of those children, as adults, never learned what happened to them in their early years or why the state made their past such a secret. In the Soviet Union, there were special archives that kept information about every orphaned child. It would seem that this data should be available. After all, we are talking about innocent children. But it was the other way around. Some of the archives were classified, and the documents related to orphans of unusual origin came under the control of the KGB. Even today, these records remain inaccessible. This is strange because many years have passed, and many former orphans have no way to find out where their roots are and who their parents were. Imagine being told your whole life that you are an orphan, your family is gone, and you have no past. And then, decades later, someone finds a document that reveals that your parents may have been repressed or that you have living relatives. This is exactly what happened to some adult orphans in the 90s, when some of the archives were opened after the collapse of the USSR. These people accidentally found out that the state had been hiding their real past from them, and it came as a real shock to them. One man, for example, learned that his parents had been exiled to a camp, and he, as an infant, had been taken to an orphanage where his origins were carefully concealed. What are the KGB archives hiding? Why are some of the documents on orphans still classified as secret? According to one version, these archives contain data on special children who were probably descendants of famous or politically dangerous people. In order to prevent the children from finding their relatives and the public from learning the truth about how and why they were orphaned, the USSR authorities preferred to conceal any information about them. Some historians believe that the closed archives may contain information about children who were secretly transferred to other families, often officials and party figures, or taken to closed institutions. These could have been the children of repressed scientists, military officers, and other people whose fate was not supposed to spoil the image of the Soviet authorities. Today, decades later, it seems logical to open all the archives so that children who have become adults can learn the truth. However, some data are still classified, and it is almost impossible to access them. This may be due to the fact that the Soviet system did not want to leave traces of its interference in the personal lives of citizens. Another reason may be that discovering the truth would be a new shock to society, and such secrets can reveal unexpected aspects of life and politics in the USSR. These stories remind us how important it is to preserve memory and protect the rights of every individual, especially those who cannot stand up for themselves. The secrets of the past hidden in the archives are still waiting to be answered, and perhaps someday they will become available so that people can reclaim their past.